Jim, thank you so much. That really, you are the first interview today, and you are just like, filling my soul. So I greatly appreciate
Oh,
it.
that's great. I coordinate the Gay and Lesbian Film Festival in Atlanta as well as being an arts writer. And we showed this last night, and wow, I mean, our audiences just loved it. And this was my second time seeing it. So thank you so much. I really
Did they
appreciate it.
talk back? Did they talk back to the
They
screen?
cheered, they laughed in moments. And the response was just so great. So it was incredible. Thank you for making this documentary. I have so many questions for you. I want to go in and jump in. But Richard grew up in Macon, Georgia, which is not far from where I was born. How would you say that growing up in a small town like that influenced him, or did it restrict him in some ways?
From everything that I've learned is that on the one hand, there were conservative elements
Sure.
that looked at him askew and that didn't understand and welcome him. But as we show in the film, there was also this underground scene in Macon
Exactly.
at Ann's TikTok, where white and black, straight and gay came together.
Mhm.
As the Macon historian said, it was a gay bar. So, I love that we have been told a certain history, and that history oftentimes paints out the very vibrant presence of queer people. And here you have in Macon, 1940s, this a community that sees one of their own and takes him in. And that's really, I think, counter to the narrative that some people would like to negate, but that others of us know to be true.
Okay. Richard spent some time in Atlanta. Can you talk about a little bit about his Atlanta years and how that shaped him and helped him professionally?
Well, I think before little Richard could have the meteoric rise, he had to have the regional journey. He had to make it out of Macon first. Sorry, it just sounded funny. And then do the Chitlin circuit, and as you said, Macon is what, like an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta. And so and also the train was running there. So it's a logical part of his progression to come to a bigger city with the Peacock Theater, with a vibrant Black arts and music community, and kind of get a notch in his belt as a performer.
Okay. All right. There's so much complexity to this documentary and about Richard himself, but I was fascinated by, Richard's sexuality because he was gay, but it seemed like he didn't really talk about it that much till maybe the end. But he also was married to a woman. Can you talk about his sexuality?
Well, I think Richard is intersexual and intersexual in many ways. There is certainly through his voice, we learn, like, hey, I was gay, but I'm not gay anymore. I'm married to a woman, and after his marriage ends with Ernestine, we talk about he goes back to, a lifestyle that he had enjoyed before.
Mhm.
It's I think he's rather bold in many ways, because when he was on talk shows in the 80s talking about, like, yeah, and when people ask him, were you gay, and he's like, yeah, Liberace wasn't fessing up. And I'm not dissing Liberace, but what I think is interesting for me is, even though he had an uneasy relationship with his sexuality at a time, the Reagan 80s, he still is saying that this is a part of his experience. Now, it's unfortunate that he could not find a peace within himself
Mhm.
to own and live in his multitudes. But I think that there is something radical in his act of expressing himself in a very public space.
Okay.
But unfortunately, with negative connotations. Yeah.
There's this amazing quote that I really stopped the film and watched it and wrote it down. Black music is a wellspring of American popular music, but at the same time, there are industries and societies that are very often do not value Black creators or what the Black or want the Blackness toned down. Boy, that really leapt out at me. Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, you know, one of the things that we look at in this film is this idea of appropriation.
Yeah.
And as Zangia Robinson says, you know, more harmful than appropriation is obliteration.
Yeah.
The two go hand in hand. And it is something in the story of American popular music as it relates to Black artists in this time that continuously comes up.
Yeah.
This, you know, the Tutti Frutti from Richard to Elvis Presley to Pat Boone is indicative of the Black artists, their contributions being sidelined, and then people saying, and the person who made this famous is Pat Boone. Well, no, the person who introduced the innovation of rock and roll, the energy of it, the performance was Little Richard.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I took away from this, you know, there's so much about, you know, race music, as it was called, not being played on white stations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You know, it's interesting is it's not that long ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's less than 100 years ago where Black artists and their innovation was segregated, contained. And what, you know, I love what happened with Richard is music, as he said, you know, broke the walls of segregation. Well, didn't break them completely, but it started a movement towards Black and white teens coming together, dancing together, experiencing joy together, experiencing one another who might not have had any contact at all with the other race. And so I think that is an interesting part of the explosiveness and infectiousness of this music is how, and of Richard himself, is how he shifts culture. He doesn't shift culture in outward ways like a Dr. King who's marching for civil rights, but he is shifting it on a whole nother level.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, rock and roll is one of the greatest American exports. It has fueled literally political revolutions in other countries. And it also had a power here of opening up perception and changing things from just having two separate charts to a world now where, think about it, rap music is one of the biggest art forms.
Sure.
So, you know, we go from one extreme of limitation to now, you know, 70 years later, a whole nother space of how music can speak to communities across the board.
How do you, I mean, there's another great quote in the movie or an analogy about the fact that, you know, he was able to break the wall and come forth and get his music out there roughly around the same time that Emmett Till was murdered. How was Richard successfully able to get it out there and play his kind of music and do his thing at the same time as Emmett Till was murdered?
You know, when I was working on this film, what was important for me was not just to be in the past tense, like Richard did this, Richard did that. I'm always interested in my films about, you know, the social context within which cultural moments happen. And I felt it was really important to have this parallel, that to show that at a moment where Richard is bursting on the scene, literally in 1955, is the same time that Emmett Till is murdered for supposedly whistling at a white woman. And Richard is actually playing with presentation. As he said, he's putting on makeup. He's making himself especially effeminate so that he would not challenge audiences and places that would be frightened about his effect on their kids, and especially the young white women.
There are so many great interviews in this documentary. I mean, can you talk a little bit? I mean, was it pretty easy rounding up all these people to be in the film once you told them what you were doing?
It's scheduling is always a
Oh yeah,
pain, but surprisingly, everyone was incredibly generous with their time. They wanted to share the importance of him to the trajectory of their careers. It's never easy, and sometimes you chase somebody for 9 months, and then you get a call saying, "Can you be in London in 2 days?" But you know what? I keep my to-go bag at the door, so I rose to the challenge.
That's great. This is a loaded question, but can you just talk briefly about Richard's legacy and the way he influenced so many other artists and people in the industry?
So, I think Richard's legacy is multi-tiered.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are the great hits. Then his legacy we see through the artists he influenced, from the ones in the film, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, to Prince, to, I conjecture, contemporary artists like Harry Styles, Moses Sumney, and the list goes on. I think then there's another layer to legacy, which is cultural change happens slowly. It doesn't happen overnight. And when you are a transgressive figure like Richard was, your ripple effect is part of what moves us towards change, towards greater gender fluidity, and providing ultimately, I think, a platform for many modes of self-expression. Even though he was not truly the beneficiary himself, I think he is a catalyst for great change. He planted a lot of seeds in his garden.
Yeah, I love the fact that you have, out people like John Waters and Billy Porter talking about his influence, and how the fact that, they wouldn't have their career if it weren't for Little Richard. Can you sort of talk about that?
Well, I was interested in speaking to John Waters initially because I'm obsessed with this idea of the teenager, which is a construct that kind of happens after World War II. We didn't have teenagers before. And in Hairspray, John Waters is talking about what happens, in this fantastical world of the explosion of rock and roll, of it bringing white and Black kids together. And then John Waters had a very famous interview with Little Richard, where after the interview, Little Richard was like, "No, I don't want you to publish it." So I knew that on multiple layers, he had a connection and a great love of the music. Billy Porter is just, I think, so phenomenal. I'd like to think he's a love child of Little Richard, and just an important, unapologetic human, and is to me a part of really picking up a torch and moving it forward in a way that Richard never gave himself or wasn't allowed to have the agency to do.
Okay. I thought I knew a lot about Little Richard till I saw this documentary and realized there were just so many more layers that I didn't know. Lisa, what would you say surprised you the most about Richard as you were doing your research and conducting interviews?
Uh, well, there's some things I don't want to talk about because they would be spoilers.
Exactly. Okay.
Like, his origin story, the community that he and family he created outside of his own, I think is really special, but you got to see the film. I love the stories of his generosity.
Yeah.
He was super generous. And I love that after, he picketed ATV for back royalties, that actually it didn't make it into the film. But Michael Jackson, when he bought the ATV catalog and he heard that Richard had not received anything for many years, he actually gave him money. And I'm always intrigued by that story. I think it's very interesting. But Richard is the gift that keeps on giving. I think we all have a little bit of his DNA. He burst on the scene like from another world. He's interstellar. This is a film about legacy and joy and a forgotten history. And a person we thought we knew, but really, in allowing him to tell his story in this film, we learned so much about not only the exterior, but also the interiority of this man.
I think we can all agree that Richard was such a groundbreaker, and we talked about his legacy, but I mean, and the fact that he probably didn't get his due, he probably didn't get the attention that he deserved while he was here. Do you think that bothered Richard? Do you think that it weighed on him that he really didn't get the respect that he should have?
Richard was very public
Yeah,
about all the careers he started. Because
sure.
don't forget, it's James Brown, it's Jimi Hendrix. There's a ton of artists who he is a part of their foundational story.
Mhm.
And when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame happened, he was not able to participate. And really, maybe that would have been a moment where he had recognition.
Mhm.
But he was vocal that he wasn't recognized. And I think that's why the American Music Award is very poignant.
Gotcha. I think that's all I have. The documentary is extraordinary. It plays in theaters on April 11th, and then it'll be available on video on demand. I cannot wait for everybody to see this documentary and talk about it. Lisa, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you so much for this extraordinary documentary.
Thank you so much, Jim. It was a great pleasure to be in conversation.
Thank you so much.